So as I pointed out to you, it's the last Sunday of Christmas, right? And we've covered really a multitude of Christmas stories in the season of Advent and Christmas. I mean, we talked about Joseph's dilemma, which is only found in the gospel story told by Matthew. Then we heard the traditional Christmas story with angels and shepherds and no room at the inn and Jesus laid in a manger. That's only found in the Gospel of Luke. Last Sunday, if you remember, if you were here, I read from Galatians, one of Paul's letters, that talked about at the right time, God sent his Son to be born, that we might be adopted into God's royal and divine family. Different takes on the Christmas story. But we have one that we haven't dealt with yet. It is this Gospel of John that I just read to you. Because Mark, the only other gospel that we can mention, has no birth story. It starts with Jesus beginning his public ministry. But John doesn't take the traditional route by any stretch. He doesn't settle for starting at the beginning of Jesus' life. No. That's too short. John goes back, way back, not just a few years, but to the beginning of everything. He goes back to the beginning of the Bible, as a matter of fact, as in Genesis, the first book of the Bible. He uses the exact same words that Genesis uses, in the beginning. Not the beginning of Jesus' life, mind you, but the beginning before there was anything. Before the Big Bang, there was God. And John says there was also something called the Word. No, not the Bible as in this word, not a single word. There's another word for that, by the way. It's lexis. Matter of fact, we get the word in our English usage, the lexicon. If you were going to talk about a single word, that would be lexis or lexicon. This is something completely different. Matter of fact, the word is different here. This word is in Greek, logos, not lexis. Lexis meaning a single word. Jesus Christ is the logos. But what is that? What does that mean? It's very complex, but let me just try to explain it, because I think it will deepen your relationship with God. If we translated that with all of its kind of packed theological significance, what you would get is not the word, but reason. Or even more simply put, purpose. So to have reason or a purpose, there is something that is needed before that, and that is intelligence. But let's reread this. John writes, in the beginning was purpose, and that purpose was with God, and that purpose was God. It all begins with God, and God has a purpose, and he is purposeful. God is smarter than all of us put together in this room, and he has purpose to get things done. He knows where he is going, and he knows that things are going to happen. But hold on. Things change in verse 2. All of a sudden we go from, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, or it was purpose. Then it goes, he was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all. So purpose, or that logos, that purpose of God is not an it, but a who. And of course we all know who it is. It's Jesus, the Son of God. But all of God's purpose, all of God's intention is contained in the person of Jesus. You know, personally, I think this is brilliant writing by John. I mean, this is obviously divinely inspired. And I'll tell you why. John was a fisherman. He was probably uneducated. He must have been really listening good to God to get this down on papyrus. I will tell you, because it is divinely inspired. I mean, I would have been like, well, Jesus is the Son of God, therefore he's God, and I'm about as deep as a glass of water, and that's all you would have gotten from me. But John has this beautiful theological prosaic here. And John was listening. I'm convinced listening to God, because he writes, in the beginning was purpose and intention. It wasn't random. It wasn't, it just didn't come together by some stroke of lightning. But it's all wrapped up in the person of Jesus. In other words, and John puts this together later in the Gospel, everything you need to know about God at all in heaven, the God whom we cannot see, can be understood in the person of Jesus. So that begs the question, of course, what is God's intention or purpose for humanity? All we have to do is look at Jesus. Think about this. Jesus is this, and John uses the same verbiage. Jesus is this light in this dark world because it is a broken world. And God wishes us not only to see and recognize that light, but also to reflect it to others. God says we should be like the moon. There's never a time that our moon up in the sky is ever in darkness, because it is in such a position that it is almost always, except during an eclipse, reflecting the light. And that's what he calls us to do, is to reflect the light. And if we position ourselves in such a way that we are aligned with God's Son, we too become light to the world. Think about that. John the Baptist was the one testifying to the light, pointing to the light, witnessing to the light. We don't generate light. John the Baptist doesn't generate light. We only reflect it. That is a call for us to be that light in the world, not that we are the source of it, but that we are merely channeling it. But let me get more specific here. Maybe you've heard this, but Paul Harvey, a number of years ago, when he used to do his segment called The Rest of the Story, relayed a tale about purpose and light to the world. He talked about a man who was a good guy, family man. He wasn't mean to his family. He wasn't a Scrooge. He was kind and decent. Everybody liked him. He was generous. But he just couldn't get his head wrapped around this Jesus business. He couldn't get his head around God coming to us in the flesh. It didn't make sense to him, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. And so finally one Christmas, he says to his wife and his kids, I'm just not going with you to church on Christmas Eve. I feel like a hypocrite sitting there, and I'd rather stay home, and I will even wait up for you to come back from candlelight Christmas Eve service. And so they went, he stayed, and he sat down in front of the fire to relax a little bit. And then all of a sudden, during the time that he was sitting there, it started snowing, and it started snowing a lot. And he thought it was going to be quite a snowstorm, and he heard some thudding against the window in the living room, his picture window. He was wondering what it was. He goes out and checks, and he sees that there were some birds that were flying in this winter weather, and they saw the light. They probably realized this would be a great cave to fly into and rest for the night, but there was a window there, and they all hit the window, and they were on the ground kind of struggling. And he thought, well, this isn't good for the birds in that weather. They will be in trouble if they sit out there all night. So he decides, because they live in the country, that he's going to go out to the barn, because they have a barn where they keep the horses, and he'd open the barn up, and he'd turn the light on, and maybe they'll see that, and like wanting to come into the living room, even though there was a window, they could go into the barn and stay warm. So he goes out and he opens the barn door, but they wouldn't come in. So he goes in and gets some breadcrumbs, and he creates a trail of breadcrumbs for the birds to eat the bread and go into the barn, but they wouldn't do that either, so he tried to chase them, but they didn't want anything to do with him. They were scared of him. And he thought to himself, I'm not going to be able to help these birds, they're afraid of me. Everything I do, they misinterpret. If I could just be a bird, he thought. If I could just transform into a bird and mingle with them, speak their bird language, maybe they wouldn't be so afraid, and they could follow me into the barn where they would be safe and warm. If I could only be a bird and help them understand. And at that moment, Paul Harvey relates that the bells from the church were starting to play. They had a multi-bell system. They started playing "O Come All Ye Faithful" on their carillon. And it made sense to him. That's exactly what God did. And John put it this way: the Word, God's purpose and intention, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Purpose put on skin and bones and spent time with us here on earth. I mean, this is so different than Mary and Joseph in the barn or in the stable with a manger. This is a Christmas story, though, but just on a different level that's so different than Luke's gospel. I mean, even the Greek philosopher, where we have the Socratic method, and even the Western way that we think, which I don't have time to get into, the way we use logic in our life comes from Socrates. And he made this statement, which was before the time of Christ. Oh, that someone would arise, man or God, to show us God. Probably one of the most brilliant minds of all time, Socrates. Yet he was struggling to get his mind around, is there a God, and what is this God like? And God is unknowable unless God would just show himself. And his student, Plato, repeats this later on and says, unless a God-man comes to us and reveals to us the supreme being, there is no help or hope. I mean, these guys were both before the time of Jesus, and they knew that without God coming to us personally and telling us about God, we're only guessing. But it isn't only Greek philosophers. Jewish theology. So in other words, our brothers and sisters whom we are connected to through Abraham. Jewish theology talks that God is ineffable, unknowable, except for what God does in the world, like parting the Red Sea and so on. So to clear that up, God sends his Son. He shows up. God is now knowable, not just in activities or events and miracles, but God as a person that we can relate to because he's one of us. God is knowable not only by his deeds, but he takes our place. He dies a sinner's death. And you go, what's the purpose of that? The Logos. What is the word? What is the purpose behind that? It is love. There it is. Oh, that's it. God's purpose and intention is love. In the beginning was love. And that love was with God. And that love was God. Think about that. Jesus became a light of love to us in the world, that even darkness, not even hate, could snuff it out. And they gave it a great try on Good Friday, I'll tell you. They tried to snuff out that light. They tried to snuff out love. But Jesus came out of the tomb on Easter morning with purpose, the purpose to tell his disciples and us that love wins in the end, and that the death of him on Good Friday was not the end, but just the beginning of love. One great known Christian author by the name of James Montgomery Boyce writes about this paradox of God, and I want to share it with you. Jesus endured a human birth to give us a spiritual rebirth in faith. Jesus occupied a stable so that one day we might occupy a heavenly mansion. Jesus had an earthly mother so that we could know our heavenly Father. He became a subject or a slave to all so that we might be free one day. He left his glory so that one day God could give us his glory. He was made poor so that one day we would be spiritually rich. He was welcomed by shepherds that Christmas morning so that one day we would be welcomed by angels. He was hunted by Herod and Caiaphas and the Pharisees so that we may be delivered from the grasp of Satan. The great paradox of the Christmas story, but it is a beautiful thing. God reverses the roles for our benefits. So I would tell you that John 1 is what I would call the cosmic Christmas story. It's amazingly beautiful, it is true, but it's also complex. So let's keep it simple. God's love came to us so that we may experience it for ourselves. Amen.
Amen.